Chapter 10, Development. Earth has nearly 200 countries, and they can be easily classified in their level of development. The development process is continuous, involving never-ending actions to constantly improve the health and prosperity of people. There's your key issues for this unit, all 4 key issues. Today's content objective: explain why development varies among countries worldwide using key United Nations factors and indicators. Your I can statements: define development. 2. Explain the 3 main factors in determining a country's HDI. 3. Identify the HDI standard of living factor. Economic. It's also synonymous with economic factors. Next, identify the HDI health factor, which relates to demographic. Next, identify the HDI access to knowledge factor, which is synonymous with social. Next, explain how regional variation can determine different levels of HDI within a country or in a region, and explain the weaknesses of HDI. Quick video if you want to look at if the world were 100 people. You can see that again ties into population. Nearly 3/4 of the people live in less developed regions in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. When we classify countries, development is the process of improving the condition of people through diffusion of knowledge and technology. The 2 groups that the United Nations creates for the development of countries is on a continuum. Those that are developed countries are MDCs, or the acronym MDCs. That means they're very highly developed countries within this spectrum or this continuum. The other is a developed country. A developed country is making progress or some progress towards development. Developing countries fall in the classifications of high, medium, and low developing countries. Here's a look at gross national income in 2009. It's changed somewhat in 2020. However, we see some similarities with the lowest economic development in sub-Saharan Africa and then parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And more developed in what is referred to as MDCs in North America, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, with the outliers of Japan and South Korea. Those would be referred to as MDCs, or very high developed regions of the world. United Nations, how did they come up with HDI? Well, one is they rank countries according to the development. They measure the poverty level. They look at GDI, and also known as GII, which is the Gender Development Index and Gender Inequality Index, which ranks the development of men and women. And they also have HDI factors that rank how a country falls within the continuum of development. The United Nations has HDI, or Human Development Index, has 3 indicators. Those indicators or factors are 1, a decent standard of living. 2nd is long and healthy living. And 3rd is access to knowledge. As mentioned, the 4 classes that they fall into is the developed countries are very high developed, and that's Western Europe, United States, and outliers like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And then every other country is a developing country, so an LDC, and they fall in the classifications of high, medium, or low. Here's a great video by Hans Rosling. And this shows you the classifications of developing countries and developed countries. These are scores of 2018. We can see that the very high developed, or MDCs, again, are North America, United States, Canada, as well as Western Europe, including Northern Europe with the Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and Denmark. And then you have Russia, or Russian Federation, and below it, the country of Kazakhstan, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and we also have, in this map here, Argentina is very high developed, above a 0.80. And the lowest developing countries are Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Central Asia, Afghanistan, parts of Southwest Asia, Yemen, and Syria. Okay, quickly review what we've covered. All right, developing regions. We divide the world into seven developing regions and two developed regions. In addition to the 9 regions, 3 other distinct regions, as already mentioned, outliers are Japan, South Korea, in the South or Oceania, the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and then Russian Federation. Here we look at regional variation. Within countries, we can see that development is ranked here, and we see the 2 lowest developed regions of the world are Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. We look at development along HDI. There is not a country that's a perfect 1. A 1 is a perfect score in HDI. We can see that developed countries have HDIs that are 0.8 or higher. And then when we look at Russia, this bar graph is not accurate to the 2018. Russia should be at about 0.8 or a little bit above, but the one thing about Russia, which we learned, is that it's the largest multi-ethnic state in the world, and there's different regions of Russia that can lower the HDI score in Russia. So for some years, Russia could be classified as developed, and other years it's classified as developing. All right, here's a look at the top 10 rankings of HDI, with Norway coming in at 0.94. We can see the gross national income. That's going to be a standard of living measurement, which we'll talk about later in the notes. Then we can see Australia, and then at the bottom list, number 10, Sweden with 0.9. All these countries, again, are found in the core region. They're found in the north-south split above the 30-degree north parallel. And we can also see that money, gross national income, does not necessarily tell the whole picture of development. Development incorporates much more than economic development. As we can see with New Zealand, that ranks number 5th in the world in HDI score. All right, and here we're looking at there is a great deal of variation within development within a country, so that it's hidden by aggregated data, so we cannot see the regional variation within any of these countries, so that's a weakness of HDI. But we can definitely see that there is a discrepancy between their HDI score and their gender inequality index. So in other words, the country could be highly developed, be a very highly developed country, and yet the equality for women is lower than the development of the country, as we can see for France. And also Argentina, a huge gap. All right, so HDI is not a perfect indicator of development. It doesn't reflect the whole country because of regional variation. You can have higher economic and social development that are not reflected in production and trade. So again, as we saw with New Zealand, they have a higher social development than other countries, and that would rank them high in HDI. So 2 distinct glaring flaws with HDI is that, again, it's not a perfect indicator that economic doesn't show the regional variation. It also doesn't show the distribution of wealth, and it also doesn't show the equality between men and women. All right, again, here's a look at regional variation within countries. Well, we can take a look at, let's just take a look at Southwest Asia and North Africa up here. What it says there, medium developing on an average but wide variation between high developed Saudi Arabia and low developed Yemen. So it's a region that has low developed countries like Yemen and a very high a rapidly developing country like Saudi Arabia. All right, economists also look at satisfaction within the standard of living. So as the standard of living rises, happiness does not necessarily increase. So when we're talking standard of living is usually measured by economic factors. It does not necessarily increase happiness. There are other cultural factors or social factors that weigh into happiness. As you can see right here with Costa Rica topping the countries with the happiest and only making $15,750 dollars a year per person. All right, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right, more on regional variation. Okay, again in review. All right, and again, this is just again reviewing. We're going to go right into the next portion of notes, and this is a continuation of Key Issue 1 of Chapter 10. Describes the I-CAN statements are describe measurements of the HDI indicator of standard of living. 2, describe the measurements of HDI indicator of health and healthy living. 3, describe the measurements of HDI indicator of access to knowledge. 4, explain the 5 economic sectors and give examples of jobs found within each of those 5 economic sectors. 5, define productivity and value added. And 6, explain how productivity and value added factors advance economic production of MDCs and further divide the development of MDCs and LDCs. In other words, creates a larger gap of development between MDCs and LDCs. Standard of living has 2 functions. The first is gross national income. When we look at gross national income, be very careful that it's gross national income is talking about the income of the entire country of outputs of goods and services produced inside the country and outside the country. So gross national income also incorporates transnational corporations and offshore businesses or outsourced movement of consumer goods. You want to look to make sure that you read the labels very carefully. GNI per capita would be the average per person of number of goods and services produced in a year, both inside the boundaries of a country and outside the boundaries of a country. Some textbooks use GDP. GDP does not account for the money that leaves the country, though. So it's not always an accurate measurement that's used. And then per capita is important because it shows the mean or the average. But again, a flaw in looking at standard of living and GNI is that it doesn't show the distribution of wealth amongst its citizens. Purchasing power parity is another factor that's used when looking at standard of living. And when we look at purchasing power parity, it's the adjustment made to the GNI to account for differences among countries in cost of goods. So it's again adjusting the cost of living. So in other words, for example, if a resident of a country A has the same income as a resident in country B, but must pay more for a Big Mac or a Starbucks latte, the resident of country B is better off. So another way of looking at this is expendable income of a country, their take-home pay and what they're able to use on consumer goods. Here we look at purchasing power parity, and this one is purchasing power parity of 300,000 US dollars per capita. We can see that the core countries, both North America, US, Canada, Western Europe, as well as Australia, have expendable incomes that are more than 30,000 a year on average. Just be mindful that when we talk about purchasing power parity, again, it does not show the distribution of wealth within a country. All right, there are 5 economic sectors. Your book talks about 3, but other books talk about 2 more, and you should know all 5 for the test. The economic structure has 5 economic factors. Those factors or sectors are the primary economic sector that extracts materials from Earth, so agriculture, fishing, mining, forestry. Secondary are people is manufacturing, so people that work in the job sector where they take the material and they make a commodity out of it, or a manufactured output. This is secondary job. Tertiary economic sector is the goods and services to people in exchange for a payment. So they're providing a service. These are commonly the link between producers and consumers. These jobs can be retail stores, clothing stores, shoe stores, textile stores, banking, law, and education. Quaternary is another economic sector. This is a specialized subset of services. Most require a post-secondary education as well as tertiary sector jobs, but these are specialized areas of research and information and administration, specialization in collection of data or processing of information, and these are specialized service activities. Quinary is the highest level of decision makers. Those can be CEOs, those can be presidents of companies, those could be the board of a multinational corporation, or high-ranking politicians. When we talk about economic sectors, the economic sectors in post-industrial economies has shifted to service economies. So the first countries to industrialize, Western Europe and then the United States, those are countries that are in post-industrial economies. Most of the workforce is found in service sector jobs. And then whereas there's been a dramatic shift from primary and secondary, like the U.S. only has 1% of the farmers in the U.S. However, we learned that 11% of people that are employed in the U.S. are involved in agriculture, but most are in supermarkets, or most are in manufacturing laboratories working with agriculture production. Okay, again, looking at developing countries, we can see half of the world's total GNI is found in the core countries. Meanwhile, the other half is found in less developed countries. This is the gross national income in the trillions. And we can see that the gross national income of the United States in 2018 was $21.4 trillion, which is slightly below Europe with $22.8 trillion. Here's a look at the economic sectors. What we can see now, though, is yes, most of the jobs in developed country are tertiary or quaternary, quinary. In the United States, over 75% are found in the tertiary sector. And it's also important to note that in developing regions, a tertiary sector is now growing in developing countries. So we see in developing countries, which are noted here by the green lines, we can see that secondaries remain somewhat stagnant, has declined in 2015. Then we can see when we look at tertiary jobs, they've steadily inclined amongst developing countries. All right, economic structure, and this kind of forecasting in the next unit, we've talked about the economic sectors, newly industrialized countries. There are going to be countries that are now in emerging economies. We'll talk about foreign direct investment, using multinational corporate loans to help less developing countries, transnational corporations that again will help developing countries. Transnational corporations will help developing countries, and this we'll learn later is going to be done through loans. And then we have division of labor, which is created with the new labor force, the outsourcing, and the new divisions of labor that are seen within quaternary and quinary sector. And then we also have manufacturing value added, MVA, which is high skilled secondary sector jobs. Productivity is defined by the value of a product compared to the labor needed. Value added is taking the gross value of a product minus the cost of raw materials and energy. When we look at productivity, the World Bank measures a country's productivity by dividing the total GDP of number of persons employed. So for instance, GDP per employee has exceeded 100,000 in North America and Europe compared with just 10,000 in sub-Saharan Africa, which is telling us developed countries produce more with less effort. In other words, the value added they have is going to be machines, tools, equipment, and also cheaper energy and bulk materials. Here's a video on productivity. Here is a look at workers contributing to a nation's gross domestic product per hour in developed countries. The developing countries, we can see where higher value has been added. Again, in the United States, not as much as in Canada as the United States. Again, that value added is going to be seen in their productivity, their advancement of machines, tools, and equipment, and access to abundance of cheap energy and bulk materials and cheap bulk materials of raw materials. And we can see where most of the world is not. They don't have technology, they don't have communication, they don't have the infrastructure, and they don't have the value added. So, in other words, most of what the final output, majority of that wage is going to be a very labor-intensive wage, meaning that a lot of money that has gone into the final output is spent on labor to make it. We see deindustrialization, which we'll talk about next unit. We see the movement of computer automation. This is just an example of value added with productivity. Again, advancements of technology. With this case, automation. Here's an example of automation with in the retail service job. All right, consumer products. When we look at consumer products, it's going to tell us a lot about the development of a country. Products that promote communication and transportation are more readily available than MDCs and LDCs. Wealth that's generated increases the technology of both transportation and communication. When we look at MDCs, MDCs have more motor vehicles. And with more motor vehicles, they have better access to jobs and services that permit them to distribute their products. The vehicles per person in the developed region of the world is about 508 to every 1,000 people. Whereas in developing regions of the world, motor vehicles are about 102 to every 100,000 people. Again, different statistics than what we have here. And these are the latest statistics in 2020. And when we look at cell phones, they provide interaction between providers and customers, where in developing countries there's 1,200 phones per 1,000 people, and then 1,000 phones per 1,000 people in developing countries. And the main reason for this is because telephones, they don't require infrastructure. You can just set up a satellite and then or a single tower, and people can access it. So there isn't much costly investment for connecting. And then internet is also worth noting. And then the internet is going to be found in the world in general. It's 500 people per 1,000 people have the internet, access to the internet. Developed countries, 900 people for every 1,000 people have access to the internet. In developing countries, 400 people to every 1,000 people. So we can see that the technological advancements in consumption of consumer goods, which provide more taxation or more flow of money within the circulation of an economy. And with that circulating money, these more developed countries can now create more technological innovations, and they can diffuse those innovations from urban to rural, and they can also increase capital of a country, which creates a further gap between developing countries and more developed countries. Here we have GNI per capita. It's following the choropleth maps we've been looking at. Here's a motor vehicle in 2014. Here's cell phones in 17. And here's digital television. All right, quickly review what's been discussed in these notes.